Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So simple.
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 8th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran, and oh, am I very excited for this review conversation. Brendan is still not here. He shall be back very shortly. I can confirm he's back from his honeymoon. So he'll be back on the main show this weekend. So in the meantime, I had to scour the internet for this review, and I am extremely excited to have this guest back on the show. Joining me once again is Ema Sasic from Next Best Picture. Emma, welcome back to the show.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We were talking a little bit offline. The last time you were here on the show was for Broker.
Yes.
All the way back in either late December, early January, something to that effect. But when we did that episode, it was on the old format. It was before we transitioned to the new structure and now to video.
My
So
God.
now everyone gets to see your lovely face as well. Not just your voice, but we get to see you. So this is very exciting.
I know. Hopefully the hair is good. I mean, I didn't have the professional team working on me today, so everyone's just going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, I know. We should have gotten the Priscilla makeup and hair team to doll us
my
up for
God.
this review.
Oh my God. I would have been so ready to rock a beehive and just like fierce cat eyeliner. Wow. People
Yeah.
would not have been ready for it.
That would have been very exciting. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But still, it's great to see you. It's great to talk to you once again. It's been too long. I will privately and publicly apologize because it's been too long. But I'm so glad that you're here. So thanks for coming back.
Thank you.
And here to talk about Sofia Coppola's latest film, Priscilla. Before we get into the film, though, I want to hear your thoughts on Sofia Coppola. What do you think about her overall as a filmmaker?
I've been a fan. I will admit I have not seen her entire filmography. I'm missing out on two films.
Okay.
The Virgin Suicides, which is very funny. First film, probably one of the bigger ones that she's known for,
Sure.
and Somewhere. But I will get to
Yeah.
those. But I have adored Marie Antoinette, and it's punk rock type of feel. Just how different it is compared to like a normal historical biopic, if you will.
Mhm.
Fully obsessed with the bling ring and
Nice.
Emma Watson, who should have won a Best Supporting Actress that year, as far as I'm
Wow.
concerned,
Okay.
for
Very cool.
iconic lines. And
Mhm.
I mean, not everything has been a huge hit. On the Rocks maybe was a bit rocky, but
Fair.
but I'm a big fan of Lost in Translation, and I just really love the way that she gets into the female psyche, and
Sure.
she just understands the inner struggles, and she makes it feel so universal, because they are very universal, whether or
Mhm.
not she is covering a larger than life figure such as a French aristocrat or
Sure.
a French monarch,
Uh-huh.
or just a stand-in for herself. So
Yep.
I've been a really big fan of hers, and it's always interesting to see how she tackles similar themes, but in new ways with each film.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. We talked about this a little bit on episode 558 in preparation for Priscilla, but she's one of my favorite filmmakers working right now. I've loved everything she's done, including On the Rocks. I'm a defender of that movie. Do really like it. The only blind spot for me is Somewhere. So I'm with you there. That is one I do need to catch up with. But everything else that she's done, I really love. Lost in Translation, I think, is her masterpiece. That to me isn't just the best film of its year. I think it's one of the best films of the 2000s, of that entire decade. And it's incredible because that was just her second movie, but there's a sophistication and maturity to it that I just absolutely adore. But all of her films, in some ways, I love, and it certainly comes down to everything you're saying regarding womanhood or her own life, especially as it relates to growing up as cinematic royalty and the I guess the advantages that came with her life and dealing with her father and everything that we do see in her films in that regard. And maybe it all relates to Priscilla as well. We'll certainly get to
Perchance.
that. But but yes, I'm a huge fan of Sofia Coppola. So Priscilla was one of my most anticipated films of the entire year
Hmm.
coming into it. So with that, I guess we can go ahead and transition into the film itself. It is, of course, written and directed by Sofia Coppola, and it stars Kaylee Spaney and Jacob Elordi, as well as a few others that come and go. But those are certainly the two that we'll focus on for this conversation. If you're not familiar with Priscilla, when teenage Priscilla meets Elvis Presley, the man who was already a rock and roll superstar, he becomes someone entirely unexpected in private moments. Okay, there's certainly a lot more to it than that, but we'll leave it there. Emma, tell me, what did you think about Priscilla?
I loved this film. I really did.
Mm,
I mean, I know we're going to talk a lot about it, but it is I think it's so great that we're finally hearing Priscilla's story because
hmm.
last year we had Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, which was truly a gigantic, epic scope and a huge showcase for Elvis Presley, who he was, the man he became, the legend that he is continues to be 50, 70 years after his death at this point.
Yep.
And, you know, Priscilla really wasn't the focus of that film. She was in just a
Hmm.
couple of scenes here and there, but
Hmm.
I mean, she has a valuable perspective and point of view that is necessary to share because people are fascinated. What is it like living with a rock star? What is it
Yeah.
like, change having your entire life change overnight,
Yeah.
essentially?
Hmm.
And as with this film, we see she met him as a young girl, 14 years old.
Yeah.
And I mean, to really go from her life there at that point, which was stationed at a West Germany Air Force base, to literally living in Graceland and dealing
Yeah.
with fans and screaming women and all that. I mean, that is a huge change. And we've just
For
never
sure.
gotten that story before. So I was super excited to see this film and so glad to have seen her trajectory. And as Sofia Coppola does, she explores the loneliness and the
Hmm.
desertion that this woman felt at many, many critical points during their relationship. And I really think both actors do a fantastic job. They both had really, really tough jobs with this film, and one performer was a little bit more internalized than the other in terms of the performance that they were giving. But I thought that they were both just so spot on, and I just was so moved by
Hmm.
Kaylee Spaney.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there. I also really like this movie a lot. It feels like the film Sofia Coppola has been building toward in her entire career when
Hmm.
you consider, as we just talked about there a moment ago, how deeply tethered her films are to womanhood and the challenges women face, perhaps more overtly in The Virgin Suicides and The Beguiled, but it's still very much a part of Lost in Translation and On the Rocks. And then there's Marie Antoinette and The Bling Ring, where we see Coppola examining material wealth and excess and how those things play a role, something that she's very familiar with given that she does come from cinematic royalty. And now here she is with Priscilla, a film that is tonally more comparable to The Virgin Suicides and The Beguiled, but it's equally set in the world of lavish affluence given Elvis's fame. It's not dissimilar to what we see in Marie Antoinette and The Bling Ring. So, in a lot of ways, this film is an amalgamation of everything that defines Coppola as an artist to this point. And I absolutely love how she not only finds that middle ground, but examines it with the nuance that she does. Because at the heart of this film is this captivating duality, and that it's mostly a quiet movie, but its depiction of grooming and manipulation is anything but muted. It's somehow not subtle while also demonstrating vividly just how Elvis's behavior was normalized, something I'm sure we'll talk more as this conversation goes. But the command that Coppola shows in her storytelling in that regard, I think, is incredible. And it's certainly amplified things too. And I completely agree with you. The performances here by Jacob Elordi and Kaylee Spaney, who are mesmerizing. They're really, really terrific, have a great dynamic together, and they both tap into their respective characters with this diligent grace that sets up a juxtaposition that the film then sifts through with this fine-toothed comb. And how all of that unfolds here is sublime. It's really, really great. So I'm with you. Big fan of this movie.
Yeah, I was just so into every single moment. I mean, again, we will talk about it, but the costumes are gorgeous. The production design just sucks you in. Every single moment of this film, you feel like you are right in the middle of the action.
I agree. I absolutely agree with you. You're very much immersed into the dynamic between these two. And so much of what I find so affecting about the film, how the craft complements what we see on screen between these two characters, a lot of it circles back to what I mentioned in my opening thoughts regarding this centralized duality that we see at the core of this film, where much of it is quiet and wonderfully internalized, but Elvis's grooming and manipulation is anything but muffled.
Mhm.
And I do love that Sophia isn't afraid to be obvious with just how problematic that is. However, given the context of Elvis and his celebrity, the film offers credence to why it was so normalized and even why Priscilla herself was alert to Elvis despite some of his choices, which is why the film's singular perspective is so affecting here because one, much of what we see between Elvis and Priscilla from her perspective at times is kind of endearing when Elvis is with her, or at the very least, you understand why she's in love with him.
Mhm.
He's gentle with her initially. He buys her dresses and clothes. They have photo shoots together. There's a whole sequence where they spend what seems like days together, just eating and hanging out and being a romantic couple in a vacuum without any context. You wouldn't question it necessarily. There are times where it's borderline idyllic. The problem, of course, and this is the other major reason why the film's singular perspective is so affecting, is that Elvis is gone quite often.
Yeah.
And we never see the glamour of the stage, not until the end of the film when it makes sense. Instead, we see Priscilla at Graceland trying to remedy her boredom. Sophia often just shows us her walking around the house, doing her nails, getting her hair done, reading a magazine. There's a mundanity to this film that is wholly purposeful because that was her life in many
Mhm.
respects. And it demonstrates just how isolated and lonely she was when Elvis was gone, which is essential because it doesn't take long to see how those feelings are magnified when Elvis starts manipulating her when he is back at Graceland, when he starts degrading her for the color of her dress that she has on, when she gives him honest feedback about a song, when she rightfully questions him about his affairs. Elvis's reaction to those things renders this deep despondency in her. And fundamentally, it's heartbreaking to see how her sadness forms, but it's even more powerful that it's rooted in that singular perspective. I do love that approach here from Coppola.
Yes, I think really from the get-go, I think what Sofia Coppola does very well is, she very objectively presents you with the facts here. You know, this was a 14-year-old girl who knew who Elvis was, and like so many other young women and women in that time, loved him, adored him. When you see him in that first scene, I mean, even yourself as the audience member, I feel like you instantly are like falling for his charms. You are like mesmerized by really how beautiful and how gorgeous he is. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Elvis himself was a very handsome man. Jacob Elordi is a very handsome man too. And I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
you look at him, you hear the voice, you see those mannerisms, and you fall in love with that person right away. So it's no wonder why this young woman fell in love with him. And then Coppola also shows that, he was struggling with grief following his mother's passing. He was far from home. And then Priscilla showed up in his life kind of as like this very welcome presence where he could find some of those things that he was missing. However, yes, 10-year difference. I don't think a 24-year-old should have been doing that with a 14-year-old. But again, it seems
Mhm.
like Coppola just kind of presents this in a very objective way. She's not judging either side for, their parts in the relationship. I mean, I think also, you think back to this was 1959. I mean, that is so different from the life and the society that we are currently in too.
For sure.
And you see too, he was kind of a product of his time. Men had these uh very strong opinions about what their woman should be wearing, how they should be acting, and
Mhm.
while I'm not exactly happy to see that that is exactly the man that he was too, she also kind of presents it as, this was the time, and unfortunately women did not have the same liberties and the same
Yeah.
freedoms as we are afforded today
Mhm.
too. And so, it's a really great way of showcasing this society and how this young girl unfortunately found herself in like the throes of it, where she was being captured on camera. He wanted to make sure she looked good, not only for, being seen in public with him, but also just, she's my lady, she has to look good too. It's
Mhm.
just really fascinating, all of these different things. Once you kind of step back and kind of think about the bigger picture and the society that
Mhm.
they were in, how all of that comes to play.
Absolutely. And that's where Baz Luhrmann's film is somewhat of a complementary piece here, because that film gives you the broad strokes of this story
Hmm.
and Elvis's perspective that does make sense. You don't always agree, but it might make sense of the choices that he made, particularly early on in this film. But we also see this in Lerman's film as well, that when he was overseas and in the army, like that was a vulnerable time for him. He had just
Hmm.
lost his mother and he's grieving, and perhaps that's part of his psyche as it relates to his relationship with Priscilla. This film doesn't give us that context. There's a little scene early on when he talks about his mother, so it does help perhaps connect that vulnerability a little bit. But I think you could equally argue that Sofia Coppola is using that as a tool for Elvis to perhaps build a foundation as far as what that manipulation is going to look like. I
Yeah.
think it goes a little bit both ways. But you are right. The context of the time certainly presents a different Elvis then than what it would be now, of course. But Sofia Coppola is also not using that as an excuse.
Yeah,
And I think
definitely.
that's where looking at this pragmatically, as you're talking about, is it's compelling to watch and also a little bit icky
Oh,
simultaneously.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also hope that I wasn't trying to say like I'm excusing his
Oh
behavior
no no no
either.
no no. I
Yeah.
yeah no I hear you.
But it's just, yeah, you kind of like, I don't know how many of us did stop and consider, after watching Elvis, nobody's questioning their relationship, even though it's a well-known fact that there is a 10-year gap between, age gap between the two of them. I mean, even when she was 21, he's 31. I mean, all of those things are different as when you're a young woman. And I mean, you're
Yeah,
trying to find your place in the world, and you've got this older guy. I mean, it's a whole different dynamic.
I
And
agree. Yeah, and I think that's where this film is maybe at its most gripping, at least when we're talking about how Elvis is portrayed here. Because, yes, to your point, he is pursuing a young woman who was just 14. when they first met. Obviously, not great. And I love how, to your point about the film's pragmatism, how this film atmospherically taps into that simply with this casting of Elordi and Spaney and the makeup and hairstyling. The foreboding climate of this film, I think, is astonishing because, Spaney looks really young in those opening scenes.
She does.
Really young. And next to Elordi's Elvis, the images themselves do all of the talking.
Yeah.
The dynamic between them is great, but you simply experience the images and it creates this atmosphere where something is off. But underneath all of that, there's something arguably, maybe not even arguably, but there's certainly something more sinister going on with Elvis as it relates to that manipulation, that at first it might come off as a little benevolent in the sense that he wants to wait for the right time.
Right.
We got to wait for the right time. And look, not having sex with a minor, okay, the bar is on the floor at that point. Okay, the bar is on the floor because we know, at least the way that I interpret this film and how Elvis is portrayed here, it's not coming from a place of purity. It carries the facade of honorability, but in truth, by keeping Priscilla's desires contained, it keeps her on a string. And eventually it becomes one of the centerpieces of his manipulative schemes. And to me, it's really compelling to see how Sofia Coppola expertly weaves all of that together, even if it's not subtle at times, for all of the film's quiet introspection, which I really do love. I was reminded of Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon in the sense that I don't think that film is very subtle. Scorsese wears his emotions on his sleeve. Sofia, I think, is doing something similar here, but her approach, unlike Scorsese, is tonally quiet and methodical and pensive. And somehow she just threads that needle immaculately.
Yeah, and he is always telling her, we have to wait. I will tell you when the time is right. One of many instances of him being that controlling person in this relationship. But then she's flipping through all of those newspapers and magazines and seeing him with whatever leading lady he's in a movie with. She's reading all about their romance, and she's like, excuse me? Hello?
Yeah, exactly. And that is, I think, certainly part of it. And I think there's an argument to be made that he's doing that as far as Priscilla is concerned anyway. Obviously, he's pursuing these affairs very purposefully. But I think by keeping her desires contained, he knows that she will always be there building towards something, but that allows for him to keep her on that string a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, and I think there's a level of he knows that she's seeing these things, and it is just a way for him to control her all the more. Which, again, I don't know if sinister is a harsh word, but to me, it kind of comes off that way.
Yeah.
And it's obviously gross. But again, what I love about the film is that Sofia Coppola does a lot of this very pragmatically. It's very quiet and methodical. It's contemplative. And yeah, just the way she's able to present that without being wholly on the nose, because there's a version of this where another filmmaker, Baz Luhrmann, would have taken this material and it would have been, I think, maybe a little schmaltzy and heavy-handed and melodramatic. There's an Oscar bait movie of this where, it's all of those things, and this is anything but that. And it's part of it is Coppola's approach, but it's also the performances, which complement each other perfectly, I think.
I also think too, him being in such a position of power, he's got yes men all around him. These people are never going to tell him no. So he gets he gets this huge
Yes.
controlling side of him.
That's a big part of it. Yeah.
And I think too of that scene where she confronts him about his affairs and he brings out her suit, he's throwing it in there, and he's like, "Jim, get her on the next flight home. I think it's time that you go see her parents." And she
Oh my
just
gosh. Yeah.
breaks
That,
down immediately. And that is just like this crazy man in power. Like he can just do that and change everything in a second. And she has no control over it. And she truly loses it because, she tried to do what she thought was best in that moment. She wanted to stand up for herself, and he just
yeah.
continuously showed her, no, I'm the one who is in charge. I'm the one who's controlling and taking the lead here. And that scene was just so, it really
Yeah.
was like really heartbreaking because you kind of think, wow, she really has like, she's got nowhere to go. She's
Yeah.
got no good in or out in this relationship at this point. And then it's very
Yeah.
fascinating later on when she is several months pregnant, probably like 8 months pregnant. He brings her in and he tells her, I think we should take a little break from each other. And, at that point, she's like, okay, just tell me when you
Yeah.
want me to go. Like, she's either learned how to play his game or she truly has like no fight left in her. And it's like, whatever, I'll do this. And he
Mm.
immediately cowers to her. He says, I was just kidding. I was just kidding. So it's so interesting to see that role reversal and just how, as a few years into the relationship, how things change.
Yeah. I think that is a really great point. And that scene you highlight is one of those centerpieces that helps articulate what I've perhaps struggled to do here in terms of how this film is from moment to moment, there is a quiet quality to it. And Coppola is relying on these, especially with Spaney, this really introspective performance, which I love. But simultaneously, it isn't subtle. And that is another one of those that moment quintessentially depicts that where yeah, he tells one of his boys, "Hey, get her a flight and you're going home." And it's this just clear, vivid example of how he is trying to control her
Hmm.
and she breaks down. And while that might be one of the most vivid examples that we see in the film, it also comes through in, this is meant to be, I don't want to say sarcastic, but he presents himself as it's not coming from this deep place of, of manipulation, I guess, or he's not trying to be mean about it. But that moment when she walks into the room and she's wearing, I don't know, a brown dress. I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but he's like, that color doesn't look good on you.
Oh,
Like he
yeah.
just
He
flat out
hated
tells
that.
her,
He
just
hated
flat
it.
out tells you or tells her that, yeah, I don't like that. And of course, he kind of laughs it off. I wasn't trying to be mean about it, but you see Priscilla react to it in a way that, where it does affect her as it would affect anyone in that situation.
Hmm.
And there's like little things like that, or where he teases, hey, maybe you can come out to Hollywood. You can come out and visit me, but he doesn't really mean any of that. So sometimes it's him trying to be sly or clever, and other times it's just brazen,
Hmm.
as the scene that you're talking about.
Hmm.
But either way, it starts to create this despondency in her until it gets to a point where, and maybe it is the moment that you're talking about where he threatens to just fly her home, where she starts to play the game with him,
Hmm.
or she just gives up, one of the two. And, or maybe it's a little bit of both, and that's
Yeah,
where the back half of the film gets maybe even more compelling in that regard.
definitely.
Um, and I think that's where, like, so looking at this film as a biopic, I want to maybe take the conversation there, because the best biopics to me, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this too, Emma, but the best biopics to me are movies that emphasize a sliver of time versus telling a broader story that spans years or decades, such as Baz Luhrmann's Elvis that came out last year.
I
This film,
1000% agree.
Yeah. And this film is mostly the former, although it does get a little bit more broad in the end. But the bulk of this movie is that period of time when they first meet, when she was 14, as we noted earlier, and her life with Elvis after she moves to Graceland and eventually graduates from high school. So that 4 or 5 year period as a teenager is most of what we see in this film, which is important because it vividly demonstrates that duality that we were talking about earlier and the melancholy that forms in Priscilla that needs to be felt, giving us bullet points about Elvis's career or superficial things that happened in their relationship that I think would have undermined the film's emotional progression. So maintaining that, I guess, that singular perspective and emphasizing that 4 or 5 year gap, I think does this film a lot of service, and I think is great. Now that being said, and this is where things get interesting in this regard, because the third act does get a little bullet pointy in its storytelling as it moves beyond just her years as a teenager. And we see Elvis and Priscilla get married. They have a kid. We see Elvis have his comeback special and then off to Vegas there in those final moments. And while I don't love the bullet pointy stuff, however, what I do love, and this is the biggest difference between a Baz Luhrmann and a Sofia Coppola, is that even though the story gets a little broader there in the end, the focus is still on Priscilla and her mundanity and her loneliness, her becoming a single mother in some ways, and eventually just living a completely separate life from Elvis altogether. So it's still a far cry from Baz Luhrmann's film and its Wikipedia script. This film isn't trying to give us some sort of grandiose exposition on her later years and how her relationship with Elvis fell apart. It's a complimentary piece to highlight what we had seen previously, and that even after they got married, after they had a baby, he's still trying to control. He's still trying to manipulate. She's still living this mundane, separate life. It's maybe a little jumbled. I don't think it's as seamless as what came before, but on the whole, I love that singular focus and contemplative approach. I think it's arresting, and it leads to a final moment that I think is as satisfying as it could have been.
Yes, I'll note that, this entire story is adapted from Priscilla Presley's memoir, Elvis and Me. So, we're definitely getting just those years, which makes for, as you said, a more compelling biopic when it's more contained to a certain period of time. That's when you can really explore a certain character and who they were at that moment. I always thought that Baz Luhrmann's Elvis should have focused on the Las Vegas residency years, because you really see him at his highest high and truly getting at his lowest point. I think that would have made for a very, very strong portion of that film, because I was super into that portion of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, with this one, we just are focusing on her life with Elvis because, number one, that's what most people are ever speaking with Priscilla Presley about, and number two, I mean, that is so much change happened to her in that time. Many good moments, and I'm sure very, very many bad moments too, as we've seen in this film. And yeah, I would agree too with the ending and the third act. It does kind of lose a little bit of that cohesiveness that we saw more so in the first half. But then I also, I also consider the whole film. We really see their relationship fall apart slowly but surely. And, when you get toward that end, they both kind of just give up a little bit, not a little bit, a lot. I mean,
yeah, a lot of it.
a lot of it.
Yeah.
They have that scene in the limo where he's like, "I'm gonna go to Palm Springs," and she says, "Yeah, I think I'm just gonna go take Lisa Marie to Las Vegas." And it's like, okay, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
whatever. I'll see you when I see you.
Yeah.
And we get, some snippets of her life in that Los Angeles home. And it was actually really nice to see her hanging out with the people that she wants to have dinner
Yeah.
with or like have lunch with in their backyard versus at one point when he came home from either some show or some movie set, he and his like Memphis Mafia, whatever it was called, they were all eating with Priscilla, and she just seemed so out of place there, and she just
Yeah.
didn't have anybody to talk with.
That's a
So,
great point. Yeah.
so it's really nice to see that transition with her being in her element, and also not to mention how different she looked. She dropped the black hair. She's back to her
Yes.
natural
Yeah.
brown. She has a middle part. She really has no makeup on. She just feels like the version of herself that I think she's been
Yeah.
waiting to be.
Man, that's a really great point. I didn't even think of that really, but you're right. I mean, one of the more pivotal moments, or at least one of those scenes in this film that highlights that controlling behavior, is this quick little exchange where he says, I want you to have black hair. It's almost like it's taking a piece of her identity. And she has that for a lot of the film, whether she wants it or not. So,
Yeah.
yeah, to something you said earlier, as far as maintaining this facade of, I'm going to buy you dresses and you can have all the makeup you want and get your hair done. Like, that could be seen as him affably giving her these gifts, or is it, a way to maintain a certain look that he wants, or that he wants the public to think of? It could be a
Mhm.
little bit of both.
Mhm.
But either way, it's not necessarily who she is. And to maybe best represent that through two images, and again, didn't even think about this contrast until you brought it up there a second ago. So thanks, Emma, for this.
Of course.
But you're right. There's that moment where they're having dinner and it's Elvis and his boys and everybody is there. And what does Sofia Coppola do? We get a close up on Priscilla, who, and gotta love Spaney in this moment because she doesn't say anything.
Mhm.
All she's doing is evoking how uncomfortable and out of place she is.
Mhm.
It's a really great moment of introspective performance. And you contrast that to the lunch scene that you're talking about at the end, where we see her full of life and vigor again. And as brief as it is an incredible juxtaposition to see how she was able to regain some of that control simply by not being around Elvis at all and
Yeah.
them living these separate lives. It's incredible. And I think that's why, even if it's slightly jumbled at the end and maybe it's a little bullet pointy, but I still think what we see there is important because it does emphasize that even after they got married, after they had the child, after this, after that, she was still having to deal with his controlling behavior, or just having to figure out her life separate from him because he was never around. And I love that the film never dabbles into why that's the case for Elvis. Again, that's where Baz Luhrmann's film is somewhat of a complementary piece, because we know from his perspective what's happening, at least if you've seen that film. And so we don't need to go there. We don't need to see him on stage or to see him indulging in what he does. All we need to know is how that is affecting Priscilla.
Mhm.
And I think that comes through great in the storytelling here and the performance.
Absolutely. I
Uh,
just
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just again, I know we're talking about them this entire time, but I mean, Kaylee Spaney is so good in this movie. She steps into this role. She really shows the joys and the hard times when it comes to,
Mhm.
being the significant other of a mega superstar. And she really traded in one lonely place for another very lonely place. This one with a
Yeah,
little bit more glitz and glam compared to the
yeah.
first one, but it's still not the ideal life that I'm sure she as a 14-year-old was envisioning for
No,
herself.
yeah, not at all. Yeah,
And then, Jacob Elordi, he had a really tough job with this too because he was showcasing those private moments and the side of Elvis that I don't think most biopics are ever showcasing. Again, they're showcasing the man with the charisma and the stage presence and his hips who that are getting like women to faint
For
from
sure.
seeing him.
Yeah.
We don't get that side here. We're getting the romantic lover, the controlling partner, the
Yeah.
honestly can be set off with anything type of person.
Mhm.
It's a tough job for both of them, and I really think that they both stepped up and
Yeah.
delivered.
I agree. And I still don't think that Elordi's performance here, like I wouldn't call it a loud performance.
Mhm.
I still think there's a level of quiet calmness to it because a lot of his manipulation is through these little exchanges he has, such as, hey, dye your hair black. It's not like he's yelling these things at her. There
Mhm.
is the moment you mentioned earlier. The loudest he gets is when he threatens for her to go home. But a lot of it is just him on the phone saying, hey, you can't come right now. That's not a
Yeah.
good time.
Yeah.
Or him saying, we have to wait. We can't be intimate right now. We have to wait. Like like the way he's able to channel his controlling behavior through these sly and subtle ways of phrasing the dialogue, it does give credence to the character as to why Priscilla, especially early on, would take that at face value and still be in love with him. But over the course of time, why there's some volatility there with Elvis and how that rubs up against Priscilla's either despondency or her just giving up altogether, it certainly makes for some fascinating dynamics. But I do love those performances and how they're able to, you know, tap into the juxtaposition between them. It's really great.
Yeah.
Do you think both of these get nominated?
I currently have Kaylee in my number 5 slot,
Okay.
out of 10 nominations, because I mean, we're still waiting to see a couple of performances. I'm still waiting to
Uh-huh.
see some, but
Yeah,
I
sure.
could I could see her getting in for this. I think Jacob might have a bit of a harder time just because supporting actor is a very tough category this year, and I mean, we've already got some heavy hitters and big names in there, but you know what? I would
Yeah.
be very pleasantly surprised if he does get in there.
Yeah.
I think there is an argument to be made for both performers in terms of
Yeah.
uh, rightfully getting some nominations. And maybe it's not just at the Oscars. I mean, maybe we could see like some SAG votes or
Sure.
Golden Globe, BAFTA. You never know.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm curious to see how it plays out. I do love both of these regardless of the Oscars. I think they're both very, very good here. Spaney especially is just mesmerizing.
Yeah.
Your heart breaks for her. And one of the more poignant moments of the film for me is that final moment where
Hmm.
we see her briefly at Graceland and she interacts with a few characters that we don't see a ton of. But what I love about it is like those are the only relationships she has in this film that are genuine.
Yeah.
And it's, the housemaids there, the people that work at Graceland. But because she was stuck in her mundanity there at Graceland most of her time there, of course those are the relationships that she would probably garner the most there.
Hmm.
And it's a small little gesture from Coppola's part, but I think it actually carries a lot of weight and certainly speaks to how, to your point, how unexpected I think a lot of this was for her,
Yeah.
especially as a 14-year-old.
Yeah.
Oh man, what a good movie!
Very good
What a good movie.
movie.
Do you have any final thoughts on Priscilla?
You know what? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the costumes are so
Yeah,
gorgeous in this film.
great.
I
Yeah,
would love to see a costume nomination for this film. It's so deserved. I mean, every print, every pattern is just immaculate. Um, a lot of kudos for the production design. I know that this film was not approved to be filmed at Graceland itself, so they had to go about recrafting and recreating those locations, whether it's the living room or the bedroom. And and the gates. I mean, we see the pearly gold Graceland gates. All of that just looks so perfect to a T. Um, and another thing that, in as I was going into this film, I knew that they were not given permission to use Elvis Presley's songs. Um,
Mhm.
and I thought, oh wow, that's kind of weird. You have an Elvis movie or Elvis related movie, but you don't have any of his music. But it worked so well here. I mean,
Yeah.
you have like Crimson and Clover when they first kiss, an iconic "I Will Always Love You" by Dolly Parton as the end song. I mean, it worked really, really well, and it once again reminded me of Marie Antoinette with its soundtrack and just how it used just all these different songs and
Mhm.
genres throughout the film. So I thought it worked perfectly. It just matched and amplified
Mhm.
moods and tones even more. So it just seemed like the crafts were crafting on this movie.
Yes. Yes, they were. I cannot echo that enough because the soundtrack is great when there is music there. I think Coppola makes the right choices, but also the film is very quiet.
Mhm.
And I love how there really isn't a lot of music in this film, whether it be soundtrack or score. It just a lot of it relies on the exchanges between these characters and the internalized performances, which I really love. And to speak to what you were saying about the costuming and the makeup here, it's fantastic. I mean, we mentioned earlier that Spaney in those early scenes looks really young,
Mhm.
really, really young. And a lot of that comes through in how, the makeup and hairstyling and how they make her look that young.
Yeah.
And when she is standing there or sitting there next to Elordi, the contrast between them as far as the ages go is it's a stunning image. It really is great. And that almost exclusively comes through because of the crafts. Like the film doesn't even speak to it all that much. I mean, a little bit because and I think they mentioned she's 14 and we see that she has to ask her parents to go out and that sort of stuff. But the film doesn't just come out and say, "Hey, maybe this is a little weird." It's like that feeling is evoked by just putting them next to each other on camera. It's incredible. Yeah, the
Not
craft work here is mesmerizing. It's so good.
also not to mention just their insane height difference. There's that video of
Yeah.
Jacob Elordi on Jimmy Fallon or whoever, and he was like, "I'm 6'5," and everyone's like, "Woo!" in the audience. But it's like this girl is probably my fight, 5'3", maybe even lower. But it's like, boop, just
Yeah,
so
he's a whole foot taller.
so so jarring to see next to
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, no, I love all of that. Great movie. I very much do recommend it. Sofia Coppola with another hit on her hands. With that said, we do have a written review of this up at InSessionFilm.com if you want to go and check that out. Did you write a review for this as well, Emma?
I did actually. Yes, I put it on my personal website, and I did the Next Best Picture podcast on Priscilla as well.
Yes.
So everybody can just hear me talking and writing about Priscilla
There you
these
go.
days.
Love that. Yeah, definitely go and check out the Next Best Picture podcast. That is on my list to do now that we've done this conversation.
There you
I'm very
go.
curious to go and check that out as well. But yeah, please go and check out Emma's work. Emma, before we get out of here, aside from Next Best Picture, tell us about your website. Where can we find you on social media? Any work you want to promote out there?
Of course, my good friend Kevin and I, we have our podcast that we do as well. It's called Weekly Pop. This week we will be talking about Priscilla and Sofia Coppola's work.
There you
So
go.
truly, I cannot stop talking about this movie and this woman. But you can find my reviews at Next Best Picture, at emasasic.com. I'm starting to upload a few more reviews there on Letterboxd, where you can just see more of my shenanigans. And then on Twitter at Emma_Sasic and Instagram and Letterboxd at Ema Sasic.
All right. Yeah, definitely go and check all that out. Great follow. Please go and give her a follow and check out all of her great work. And really appreciate you being here. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I had a great time too. Thank you.
Once again, please go and check out the review at InSessionFilm.com. We did talk about Sofia Coppola on episode 558 as well. Dave Giannini, our editor-in-chief, joined me on that episode, and we talked about why we love Miss Sofia Coppola. So you can check that out as well. Be sure to subscribe to the show, Apple Podcast, Spotify. If you're watching us on YouTube, hello. Be sure to subscribe, like, all that fun jazz. Leave us any feedback. We would love to know if you agree or disagree with anything that we had to say here. Again, leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube, or you can just reach out to us on social media. With all of that said, please go watch Priscilla. It's very good. Really liked it a lot. Thanks, Emma, for being here. Really do appreciate you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.